Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and welcome to our last ENVS seminar of this year. I wanted to start by thanking Michelle Lucci in the back for all the delicious treats that we've had this semester. I also want to thank the biology department, for co-sponsoring this week's talk. So for the cookies and crackers and everything that we needed while we figured this out. Okay, and now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Caitlin "Cat" Clarke. Cat is from Barnegat, New Jersey. She got her bachelor's from Gettysburg College, where she majored in Japanese studies. She then got a second bachelor's from Stockton College in environmental science. She has her PhD from the University of Florida in horticultural sciences. Her dissertation was titled Horticultural Production of Tea in the United States, Investigations on Genetics, Leaf Quality, and Ecology. I wanted to add a little flavor about Cat to this introduction, so I Googled her. And I learned that she was the two-time Player of the Year with the Iowa Hawkeyes of the University of Iowa. She was the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft. She was chosen by the Indiana Fever, and she currently plays point guard for them. Very busy, very busy. Take it away. Okay.
Okay, you guys hear me? Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Fendrock. Hello. This feels a little echoey and loud, so forgive me. Hi, everyone. You may call me Kat. My name is Caitlin. And I'm here today to talk to you about a couple things, mainly agroforestry and tea. As Michaela said, my dissertation grad work was on tea cultivation. And I usually start my talks by thanking you for coming to my, thanks for coming to my tea talk. So like Dr. Fendrock said, I did my grad work on tea and specifically on looking at integrating tea into the agricultural landscape of the United States. So I'd like to start today by just introducing you to tea. If you don't already know her, you can meet the plant. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about agroforestry. So you can probably kind of figure out what that might be about by looking at the words, right? Agroforestry, but we're going to drill into it a little bit more. There's some more detail that I'd like to introduce as far as agroforestry as a practice. We're going to look at some traditional systems of growing tea. In general, these are going to be agroforestry systems because tea is a perennial plant, and so there's perennial agricultural happening. And then we're going to look at some systems of growing tea in North America and kind of talk about whether or not they might fit into this framework of agroforestry. So this is tea, the tea plant Camellia sinensis. It is a long-lived perennial plant. We humans domesticated this plant about 5,000 years ago, so 3000 BC. It's been a part of our agricultural landscapes for a very long time. Like I said, it's a long-lived plant. It is growing over a very wide range geographically because we've been interacting with this plant for such a long time. We've moved it around quite a bit. So it has a huge range in Asia and Europe. And when we're looking at tea, we're looking at harvesting it for the biomass. So these little fresh shoots that are coming out of the top of the plant is what we're after as far as a crop. And when I'm talking about tea today, I'll be talking about camellia teas, or what we would call true teas. So if you've had like a chamomile tea or a peppermint tea, technically that would be a tisane. I'm actually going to use this thing. So a tisane spelled like this for the people in the back. I don't know if you can see it. That would be like an herbal tea, but I'm going to be talking about true teas. Those are teas made from the camellia plant. Something that I found a lot of people don't know about tea is that I could make all of these different products from one tea plant. So the variety in tea, the product is not so much from the genetics, but more from the processing of the leaf. There is a great genetic diversity in the entire global population of tea because it grows in so many different places and it's been used for so many different things. But there's also, at the individual level, a great biochemical diversity in the tea leaf, which is one of the reasons we're interested in it as a crop. And so depending on how we manipulate that leaf after it's been harvested, we can tease out different colors, different flavors to make a wide variety of products from it. And so even though we have the to make lots of different types of tea from one plant, there are kind of two main divisions in the genetics of tea plants. And so this is going to be our colder adapted types and our warmer adapted types of tea. So here we have this Camellia sinensis var sinensis, that's the CSS. That is we would call it a China type tea. It grows farther north. It's more tolerant of cold temperatures. And it tends to morphologically have a smaller leaf. And then the other type would be the Camellia sinensis var assamica. That you might be able to tell from the name is from the Assam region. We would call it an Assam type tea in India. And morphologically, it has a larger leaf. It can grow a little bit taller, and it also is less cold tolerant, and it'll take the heat a little bit better. So globally, tea is grown all over the world, and not surprisingly, our main centers of production are going to be up here where we think tea was actually domesticated in China and India. Those are going to be our big producers. But there's also areas of the world that you might not expect to be big producers, like Kenya or Turkey. And you can see that is growing tea production in places like South America. Lots of countries in South America are starting to become tea producers. So you can see the wide range of its ability to grow in lots of different kinds of places. But kind of conspicuously missing from any data on this map is the United States. So we don't even rank. We don't have any tea production. So why am I talking about it here? Well, it's not for lack of trying. We have historically in the United States attempted to grow tea quite a few times. And some of the older attempts date back to the late 1880s. This was the Pinehurst Tea Farm in South Carolina. There were times when the US government was kind of promoting the agricultural adoption of tea and times when Lipton was promoting the agricultural adoption of tea in this country. All of these attempts have kind of fizzled out over time, but in the past 20 to 30 years, there's been a revival of new attempts. We are able technologically at this point to address the issue that was preventing tea from becoming a viable industry in the United States, and that is the selective pluck. So if you are growing commodity tea, which is what they're doing mainly in places like India, Sri Lanka, we cannot compete with them as far as the commodity market goes. We could compete, we could be competitive tea growers if we had a niche premium product. And to do that, you need a selective pluck. And until very recently, it was not possible to do that with any kind of mechanization. It had to all be plucked by hand. But there is some new technology coming out. And what you're looking at here is a selective pluck machine at the Great Mississippi Tea Company in Brookhaven, Mississippi. Basically, this machine is able to mimic the selectivity of plucking just the correct ripeness or readiness of a tea shoot while leaving behind the older, tougher, woody stuff and also not taking the shoots that aren't ready to be harvested yet. So tea is kind of something that could possibly become at least a premium crop and niche industry for the United States. And there's interest in it. We have, there's always some stuff in the news. This is becoming kind of more prominent as time goes on. And we have, groups like the US League of Tea Growers. Mostly people who are going to be able to grow tea in the United States are going to be located in the Southeast or the Pacific Northwest, anywhere kind of warmer than zone 7, 7A, 7B. We're a little bit too cold for it here, unfortunately, but it matters to those folks in the warmer regions. So now that we've talked about tea, and you have learned a little bit about the tea landscape, at least for the US, around the world, I want to emphasize that this is a perennial plant. And As such, it has a place in a conversation with agroforestry. So agroforestry is a set of practices that combines agriculture with forestry, right? So the question is, why not, at the very outset of the potential adoption of this crop into our landscape, consider it from a potentially more sustainable point of view? So this is the USDA National Agroforestry Center's definition for forestry, combining agriculture and forestry, but it's also emphasizing intentionality and sustainability in land practices. The USDA itself also includes this idea of intention, of integration, of trees, perennial plants, and also annual plants, and perhaps also animal agriculture together to create environmental, economic, and social benefits. We can evaluate agroforestry systems by looking at what we call the 4 I's. Are these systems intentional? Have they been designed this way on purpose? Are they intensive? Do they require a little bit higher of a management input? Is it more complicated than just, I'm going to plant corn, I'm going to wait a few months, and I'm going to harvest corn? Are the spatial relationships of the different kinds of crops close to one another spatially, instead of doing something like a crop rotation where you have temporal relationship? And then is there exchange between the different crop elements of that system? These definitions, while they incorporate intentionality and integration, they also mention sustainability. And so I think whenever you're talking about sustainability, it's important to include a little bit of a framework. This is a very common framework in sustainability. It's called the triple bottom line. You might be familiar with it. If you've heard of a bottom line in terms of accounting, then you know that it's like whatever you made or lost, right, financially at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year. What that doesn't incorporate is what we would call a market externalities. So maybe you made money at the end of the quarter or the end of the year, but you did that at the expense of polluting a river or gentrifying a neighborhood. The triple bottom line attempts to incorporate these market externalities that don't necessarily have a set economic cost. It tries to incorporate them into the model of the business. So this is important to have in mind if you're talking about agroforestry viable economic model, viable economic practices for working farms and landscapes. And you can see this USDA definition incorporates this idea of environmental, economic, and social benefits. So all 3 of those facets of the triple bottom line being included in the concept of what is agroforestry. So in temperate agroforestry, we have a few different recognized systems. In the tropical world, you have a little bit more latitude. But here where it gets colder, we have kind of some practices that are generally recognized and adhered to. So we're going to take a tour through them really quick. The first one was alley cropping. And this is a nice image because it shows you're looking at pine and cotton. And it shows you the basic tenet of the increased efficiency of doing something with agroforestry practices in mind, which is vertical stratification, which allows you to catch more sunlight. So we're catching sunlight up here with the pine trees at this level, and then the lower crop, the cotton, is also catching sunlight. Of course, this is where our crops are coming from, is the plants being able to convert the light into sugars and energy to complete their life cycles. So that's the basic efficiency of approaching agriculture with agroforestry in mind. So an alley crop is generally pretty neatly laid out with a few rows of perennial and annual crops, but we can also generalize this as long-lived and short-lived crops. So while the pine trees are coming into economic maturity, the cotton is a faster plant and it will generate income for the farmer on a shorter time scale while they're waiting for the high-value trees to be finished growing. This is another application of agroforestry alley cropping. This is, I believe, in Pennsylvania. And what we're looking at is chestnut is the tall thing, and then raspberry is the shorter thing. So these are two perennial crops, right? We're not looking at an annual and a perennial anymore, but we're maintaining that vertical stratification. And the raspberries, while it'll take a few years, will still come into bearing earlier than the chestnuts will. Another recognized practice is forest farming. This is popular probably in this part of the country because but this is a little bit more complex than just foraging. This is, believe it or not, an intensively managed system. I took this photo not too far from here, around Watkins Glen a number of years ago. And what we're looking at is shiitake bolts. So these are mushroom logs here. That's what these little dots are. They've been inoculated with shiitake spawn. And they need to be in a moist, shaded environment to grow. And that moist, shaded environment here is being provided by maple trees. So when I show this to a Southern audience, they don't know what all that blue tubing is about, but I'm sure you guys know that that's collected maple sap to make syrup. There's also the shiitakes that are being grown underneath. And the element of this system that you can't see is the ducts. So shiitake mushrooms are kind of, they have a pest, which is the slug. And ducks will run through, so the farmer runs his ducks through to eat the slugs so that they don't ruin the mushrooms. And then the ducks lay some really nice, rich, nutrient-dense eggs that get sold to restaurants along with the mushrooms. So this is a nice, elegant little system here. So in general, we're talking about using the forest for farming, but I do want to highlight this idea of a non-timber forest product, an NTFP. So we're not cutting down the trees just to sell them as timber. There's other products that are higher value that are coming out of this forest system. A system or a practice that you see widely in the middle of the country is the riparian buffer. These really help with erosion. They stabilize stream banks. Of course, in the Midwest, we used to have prairies. Prairies are perennial landscapes. They have largely been converted to annual landscapes to raise mostly corn and soy. But all of that annual agriculture really destabilizes the soil because there aren't roots to hold the water system in place. And so erosion is a real problem out there. These riparian systems, riparian buffers are productive landscapes, depending on what you plant there. It can be fruit and nut trees, it can be a timber of species, but it does help to stabilize the stream bank, and it has other benefits like cooling down the water, which can be really helpful for fish and other aquatic life, as well as providing habitat corridors for wildlife in those areas. Then we have silvopasture. This is popular kind of in the southeast of the United States, where it mimics, what we're mimicking here is a pine savanna. So that would be a simple stratification to the naturally occurring biome there of just kind of tall pine trees and then grass underneath. And then we have animals running through. Now, for a long time, farmers in the United States were told, don't run your cattle in the woods. So this one kind of gets it's a little bit difficult sometimes for people to adopt, but this is not the same thing as running your cattle in the woods. You are intensively managing where you're allowing the cows to graze to prevent them from trampling the roots of the trees and tearing up the pasture. Also, the animals are providing a benefit to the plants as far as manure, and especially in hot parts of the country, the cows or whatever other animals really benefit from the shade. I've seen this applied actually in New Jersey, where there was a woman who was doing maple syruping, and she had her tubes up high, and she would run goats underneath to pasture underneath the trees. So there's different flavors of these. They can be applied in lots of different ways. And then finally, we have windbreaks. These are seen a lot in the middle of the country as well. Where you have these kind of vast monocrops and monocultures of, corn and soy. These tree plantations can kind of break that. So they help with pesticide drift. They help with soil erosion, windblown erosion, and they also kind of humidity. So prevent drying out, crops drying out from too much wind. And also because you're working in these big monocultures, you are kind of adding biodiversity, which is good for pollinators, it's good for birds, it's good for life in general. So with these kind of agroforestry practices in mind, I'd like to talk now about how tea has been incorporated in places where it is conventionally grown, where it's produced, how tea is incorporated in agroforestry in traditional sense. So the important thing about tea and why it is kind of naturally suited to being used in an agroforestry setting is that it is a shade-adapted plant. This is an understory plant. You can see how it would naturally lend itself to growing underneath taller trees because it wants to be in the shade, especially near the equator, especially at lower latitudes. So when you see tea being grown in places like India, Sri Lanka, close to the equator, generally it's going to do well when it is under shade. So there's been some research done on the benefits of including overstory trees in the production of tea. So I just want to talk about a few studies where they were looking at, in this one they're looking at tea quality. They collected tea that had been grown with a chestnut intercrop and tea that hadn't, and they found that in the tea and chestnut intercrop, which is kind of a way of saying an alley crop, so different crops growing integrated with one another, there were benefits to the soil, and those translated to benefits in the quality and the yield of the tea. In another study, they were looking at a tea and ginkgo intercrop. They were looking mostly at the soil activity, at the microbial activity in the soil. So the microbial biomass of carbon and nitrogen increased in this intercrop, and then they also found a positive relationship between those microbe activity, right? The enzymes are coming from the microbes, and the availability of nutrients, carbon and nitrogen. And then this was an interesting one, this tea and rubber intercrop. The important thing to know about this is that it was on a rubber plant. This rubber farm was on a slope. So they were seeing a lot of issues with erosion, runoff, leaching. So they tried planting tea in between these strata. Like, you know, there's a little bit of rubber and then we'll have some tea in the middle, a little belt of tea, and then the hill goes down and there's more rubber. So they did find that there were benefits to the soil by including tea as kind of a hydrological catch for the runoff. Reduced runoff, reduced soil erosion, increased total organic matter and nitrogen, increased water infiltration. And this is one of their figures. So this is what I was describing earlier. There's the tea as kind of a catch. And you can see there's water. They're trying to illustrate here that the water runs down, it runs down really fast, and then it hits these shorter plants that are spaced more closely. And it just kind of like halts. And when water slows down, it sinks to the ground. So that includes infiltration, having those shorter plants there. There's something else I wanted to point out about this study is that I want to bring back the idea of the triple bottom line. So if you look at the economic benefit of having two different crops, you know, you have two different sources of income, that makes sense. But we also just talked about how they improved the soil organic matter. They improved the groundwater recharge. Those have benefits to environment and society as well. I want to especially highlight this watershed management aspect because they're talking about diversify water supply as a benefit. They mean to people. They mean that diversifies water supply to people because of the groundwater recharge and the possibility of being able to get water from wells instead of just from runoff or from surface water rather. So there are social and environmental benefits kind of baked in to these types of practices when they're done responsibly. I'd also like to highlight some of the economic opportunities. So this was some market rural sociology type research done in Yunnan province, China. So this is southwestern China. The people in that area were being pushed to cut down traditional forests and raise annual crops. this particular group of people resisted that directive, and they said, no, we don't want to do this boom thing that happens when we were watching our neighbors follow this advice and it's not working out for them. So they maintained their local tea agroforests, and they were able to sell their tea as shade-grown ancient tea as a premium product for the niche, really crazy tea drinkers. So this worked out for them. I think another relevant question, we've talked a lot about tea being grown in shade, whether it's been an intercrop or, like I just mentioned, in those tea agroforests where there was a very tall canopy overstory. But tea itself is perennial, so can it be used as the overstory element in an agroforestry system? Well, as you move away from the equator, you start to see populations of tea that don't really need to be shaded so much. The angle of insolation changes as you move away from the equator, so light is kind of more dispersed, more scattered, and it's less disruptive to this kind of shade-adapted plant. So I want to mention one agroforestry type practice for growing tea that is done in Japan. It's not practiced so widely anymore, but it's called chagusaba, and if you take those two words apart, the cha is the tea part, and the kusaba is of grasses and flowers. So it's prairie or fields with tea together. And if we look at these systems, these traditional systems, you can see that in the kind of yellow outline, that's where these grasslands are. And then the tea is planted here. And what they do is they harvest the grasses every autumn as like a hay, and then they spread it in between the tea plants, and they use it as kind of a mulch to feed the tea plants. So I would ask the question, is this agroforestry? Well, is it integrated? Is it intensive? I think so. There's a lot of management going on. There's definitely intention. There's definitely spatial integration, right? So I think that we could classify this, even though it doesn't look as spatially close as those alley crops or some of those forest farms, I think it could definitely be designated as an agroforestry type of system because it's on purpose and because it requires intensive management and because there is interaction between the crops involved. So now I want to shift a little bit and talk about tea agroforestry systems that I have seen in the United States. I think in a lot of cases, these tea farmers don't necessarily have agroforestry tenets in mind when they're planning their farms, but they have kind of tended toward doing agroforestry anyway, which I find really interesting. So I'll start by talking about the Great Mississippi Tea Company, right? This was the one in Brookhaven, Mississippi. These guys are kind of the model for how a small tea farmer would go about their business here in the United States. These guys have really set a standard. And I don't know, I don't want to advertise for them, but you can buy their teas online if you want to try US grown teas. They have noticed, being in the Southeast, summers are getting hotter. They noticed a dip in production in the hottest months of summer. And so what they did was went ahead and planted this tree, which is a honey locust. Honey locust is nice because it has very small leaves, and so it creates a very dappled shade, but it provides just enough relief from the heat that their production recovered in those hot months of summer. Honey locust is a legume, which means most legumes are nitrogen fixing. Honey locust is not, but it still drops some really high nutrient fruit onto the ground. Those have them around here, the big honkin legumes that fall to the ground and would incorporate into the soil. And I also wanted to include most ornamental plantings of honey locusts don't have their thorns anymore, but they do have naturally really gnarly thorns. So cool tree. Also in the Southeast, in Amity, Louisiana, we have some growers who are attempting to grow tea in concert with pine trees. So the pine is obviously for timber or pulp. It has the advantage of, with the drop of the pine needle, acidifying the soil, which is really beneficial to tea plants. They really, really like acid soil. So in addition to providing shade, this is what they're making a go of it here. You can see some of the risks, though. There's actually a downed pine tree across here. So they had some kind of tree fall. It will damage your plants, but I guess we just roll those dice. Moving out west, there are a number of tea growers in the Pacific Northwest, and I was able to visit a couple of them in California. So we have here the Bella Tea Company. You would think that it might be a little bit dry to grow tea in California. And like I said, these growers have sort of intuitively accounted for that by keeping their trees, which in addition to providing shade, these are just the native oaks, don't know what kind they are, but in addition to providing shade, they probably are making sort of a vapor barrier, right? There tends to be higher humidity in forests. So these trees providing shade, but also kind of creating a higher moisture microclimate, which the tea plant should benefit from and enjoy. Also in California, but now down in the valley, I think this was Stockton, yeah, Stockton, California. A couple acres of tea on what used to be a cherry farm. So you can see in the back, we've got probably about 200 acres of cherry trees. And those are kind of making a windbreak and preventing other pesticides or soil that might be blowing around from damaging the tea that's growing here. And they're also growing redwood, which is pretty cool and ambitious. They're growing redwood for shade along with their tea plants. These tea plants looked amazing. What was really interesting is that some of the varietals that we were growing in Florida, they were growing here and they were not happy. The ones that were really happy in Florida did not like being in California. So that genetic variety is just always rearing its head. But if we look at some systems in Florida, this was Reddick, Florida. This is kind of near Ocala, north central Florida. These growers were doing tea as an understory to persimmon on this side. They had attempted over here with mulberry. The mulberry didn't really work out for them, but the persimmon was working out nicely. And they also had a leguminous perennial peanut growing underneath. And so that helped with the kind of increased or the high demand of nitrogen that tea has, right? Tea makes caffeine. Caffeine is a nitrogenous compound. So tea is a heavy eater, they would say. But definitely tea benefiting from having shade around it here in northern Florida. And then finally, we have this other grower in Florida. He was out on the Panhandle near Tallahassee. And he was growing or is growing tea with these very wide alleys of native grass that are largely unmanaged. And what he does is, though he doesn't have any shade trees established over top, he does is try to cool the roots in the bottom of the plant by cutting the native grasses and hanging them, a lot like what they do in that traditional practice of chagusaba in Japan. I have this note up here as well, this safety decision. So oftentimes the tea growers who are growing several rows of tea very close together, and he elected not to do that because he has an issue with snakes on his property. He's really close to a body of water, and he didn't want to be trying to shimmy in between rows of tea to do his pluck and then surprise some snakes that might be living in there. But the soils in Florida are very sandy, and so this practice of cutting the grass and laying it up against the tea roots also helps with increasing the organic matter close to the tea plants in that area. So we're looking at these different practices that these different growers have all started doing. I would say, do they meet the criteria of these 4 I's? Are they intentional, intensive? Are they integrated and interactive? I would say probably yes to all of these. And I would want to add another one. another I, which would be intuitive. People have been interacting with their environments and making observations and internalizing thoughts about the natural environment for millennia. And especially when you are involved in agriculture and you're trying to do agriculture in a thoughtful and intentional way, you take cues from your environment about what you feel might be a good thing to do, a right thing to do for your crop and your landscape. So I think we shouldn't discount the idea of using intuition when designing agroforestry systems. They might not fit neatly into those boxes of alley cropping and forest farming that I described before. So on that thought, I'd like to leave with this example. You know, where can we go from here? Where does our creativity take us? This agroforestry system I saw, again, not far from here. This was a cider farm somewhere in the Finger Lakes. I wish I could remember where. But what we're looking at here is we've got rows of cider apples. And what they're growing in between the rows of cider apples is asparagus. So they have this asparagus that is high value coming up in the spring. And it produces income for them on a shorter turnaround, perhaps, than the apples do, the cider does. But then it doesn't do much after a certain point in the season. So what are they doing? They're running turkeys through the spent asparagus crop. And the turkeys are meant to be sold for Thanksgiving. So they just kind of move their flock of turkeys down the different alleys. This is kind of an alley crop. This is kind of a silvopasture. It's kind of a combination of all of it. So there's definitely room for creativity and interpretation in these systems as we think about how we might want to design them for new crops or existing crops in our country. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all the wonderful people I was able to work with at the University of Florida, my advisors, Saba here and Brantley here, and then all the people in my lab that made working on tea something I could do, and I will open it up for any questions. Yes. I can remember how to. There you go. Perfect. Okay.
So we went a little bit, we're running a little behind, but we definitely have time for a couple questions for Kat, if anyone has any.
Hi, do you know if the community that planted the tea, like if they noticed any difference in their environment, like the native plants there and how they interact?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, but I think you might be able to find it in that piece of research. So like that publication. So if you want, send me an email and I'll send you the paper. I would think that those are probably, again, I don't know, but I would think that these are probably very old tea trees. So like I said, in those areas, sometimes the tea trees can be up to 500 years old. There are reports of productive tea plants, especially in that part of China, that are over 2,000 years old. So I can't verify that, but they might have been there for a very long time. Those people were like, no, we're not cutting those down. You know, they've made it through all this time. So, but I can send you the paper.
Any other questions, Kat?
I'm just curious if you happen to know how that machine can selectively pick those little leaves without picking the other ones.
So if you, I've seen that machine in action, and you can also go to their website. It's an I don't know if I mentioned, it's an Australian company. So you can go to their website and they have videos of how it works. But basically what it is kind of two rollers that are going in opposite directions. And it's supposed to mimic that like plucking motion that you would make. It's set so that the pressure is just enough that when the shoot is at the right
thickness and like hardness for plucking, it will get plucked. But if it's past that or before that, it'll get left behind. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, yeah.
I don't need,
Oh,
thank you.
For the Zoom.
Okay. Oh. Um. Tea grows well, and seeing that in Central America, there was only one country, I couldn't tell what it was, maybe El Salvador, that perhaps grew a little bit, but because it has especially like shade-grown coffee, there is potential for shade, and also the warmth, the humidity, the water, the irrigation. It seemed like that would make
Yeah, I would agree. I think probably a lot of the reason that the smaller countries, like smaller, like land area countries probably haven't gotten into commodity tea production is because there are other places that have been doing it for so long and do it so well and on such a scale that it's just difficult to break in to that market and be competitive. Kenya is one country that's managed to do that. But no, I think tea would absolutely grow there. Just like tea grows here, it's just that it hasn't been economically viable.
Time for maybe one more question, if anyone has one. Kat, do you like tea? Okay, great. That was my question. Okay, great. Let's thank Kat and also Michelle again for all the work this semester.